Thank you very much, Miko, for the introduction and for inviting me, and thank you to the university for hosting this evening, and thank you all for being here. I'm really enjoying Geneva, so it's been very nice to be here, other than just dealing with this issue as well. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So May 14th is actually quite significant. May 15th was the day that the State of Israel was declared in 1948. So it's quite significant to speak about this issue, particularly on this day. It's also interesting, for the last few weeks, there has been a hunger strike in Israeli jails. Palestinian prisoners have been on hunger strike. And here in the city of human rights, I don't know how many newspapers reported on this, how much time they spent in the news, on television, how many pages were printed in the newspapers talking about this. It began several weeks ago with a small group of a couple of hundred, and then the entire prison population, over 5,000 prisoners in Israeli jails, are amidst the hunger strike right now. And not a word is being said. And you have to wonder why. It's only 3 hours flight. It's not even that far from here. And the issue of Israel is certainly something that people talk about quite a lot. So why is this missing? Why is nobody talking about this? And I think it goes back to the fact that on this issue, the issue of Palestine, besides the fact that it's covered in myth and covered in all kinds of contradicting stories and histories, there is this fear in the West, and particularly I see this in Central Europe, even more than in other places, to criticize Israel, to criticize Zionism. There is this fear that somebody might bring out the word anti-Semite, or somebody might, God forbid, remind us of the Holocaust. And we can't deal with that. Therefore, we will allow Israel to continue with its crimes, to continue with the oppression, to continue imprisoning thousands of political prisoners, because we cannot deal with this issue of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Even though the claim of anti-Semitism, when we talk about criticizing Israel, is complete nonsense. There's nothing anti-Semitic about criticizing Israel. In fact, there are countless Jewish people that criticize Israel all the time. Jews, from the very beginning, rejected the idea of Zionism. Most Jews don't live there anyway. But there's this fear. God forbid they will say they'll call us anti-Semitic. And I think it's important to bring this up, again, particularly here in Europe, in Central Europe. There is no issue of anti-Semitism when we criticize Israel. It's nonsense. The only reason the anti-Semitism card is played is because they have nothing else to say. And as for the Holocaust, this whole claim that on the one hand, Israel is a response to the Holocaust, and on the other hand, people often will say, well, how could people who suffered the Holocaust now do these terrible things? Both of these claims are untrue. Because after the Holocaust, out of 2 million or so Jewish refugees who lived in camps here, in internment camps in Europe, very few actually went to Israel. The vast majority of Holocaust survivors never went to Israel. Less than 10% of Holocaust survivors ended up in Israel, and many of those left. So Jewish people themselves said this whole idea of Israel is nonsense. They didn't go. And again, the claim that the Holocaust survivors are complicit with Israeli crimes is not true too, because these are not the same people. Of course, these may be Jewish and these may be Jewish, but they're not the same people. But I think it's extremely important, and again, when we talk about Geneva, the whole idea of, the notion of human rights commissions and so forth, the Geneva Convention and so on, that's the first thing that comes up, and nothing is being said when thousands of political prisoners go on hunger strike just a 3-hour flight from here, a place that people go all the time. And I think this is something that is very, very serious, and this is exactly the battle that has to be, or the struggle that has to be conducted here. Now, like I said, there's, the issue is made complicated not only by that, but also by the fact that there are so many contradicting stories, and many people don't know what actually took place and how this conflict began and who's at fault and so on. So I think it's important to touch on that a little bit. Let's see if this is working. Okay. So we know that there have been peace talks going on for a very long time. More than 20 years, actually, since the Oslo peace process began. And then we just had the American Secretary of State, John Kerry, try another round of peace talks, and of course it failed. And when we talk, when the peace talks are taking place and when the peace talks are discussed, I think it begs the question, are Israel and Palestine one country or two? Because if you have peace talks, it usually means you have two countries at war. And then you end the war by having peace talks. But is this the case? Israel and Palestine are not two countries. Israel and Palestine are one country. It has two names, but it's the same country. Israel and Palestine are also one state. Israel and Palestine is governed by the state of Israel. Israelis and Palestinians, though they are two different people, are governed and ruled by the state of Israel. There's one state, there is one army. It's not two people at war, which is often what the impression that people often have. It's not two nations at war, it's not two countries at war. So what is needed here are not peace talks, which is why they're failing. The reason the peace talks keep failing is because the peace talks are not solving the right problem. They're trying to create the impression that there is a problem that they're trying to solve, which is not true. If we are really interested in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it's important to recognize, number one, that Israel and Palestine are the same country. Number two, that there's only one army. And number three, that it's not an issue of two people at war. It's an issue of a brutal, oppressive regime. One side is the oppressor, one side is the oppressed, and what is needed is a concerted effort to end the oppression, similar to what took place in South Africa, where you had a concerted anti-apartheid effort that went on for a very long time, at the end of which apartheid was removed. So if we're serious about this issue, that is how we need to view this, and this is where it needs to go. There has to be a concerted movement, a concerted effort to end Zionism, which is the same as apartheid, to remove this oppressive Zionist regime from Palestine in order to bring about the end of this conflict and replace it with a democracy. But as long as people treat it as though there are two countries, two states, they're at war, and darn it, they just can't get along, and the peace talks, the world keeps trying and trying, but they just can't get along for one reason or another. Both sides are at fault. Both sides are to blame. We have to create this imaginary balance. Then there will never be a solution. And I think it's fair to assume that this is one of the reasons the peace talks are in existence, is in order to maintain this myth, in order to maintain this impression that is really, these are two people that can never get along, and this is why we're in the state that we are. As opposed to making absolutely clear, Israel is at fault, Israel is to blame, Israel is the problem. And until that is being said, clearly nothing will change. Now, people often like to discuss how this began, how the conflict began, who was at fault, who attacked whom. And again, there's a lot of myth, a lot of contradicting stories. I think it's important to realize, first of all, that the reason there's a conflict is because, not only in that part of the world, but there are conflicts in other parts of the world, is because there was a time where white people in Europe thought that they could control countries of other people who were not white, divide them, take them, give them to others. They had the right to do this. And we often hear of the Balfour Declaration. In Israel, basically the Zionists talk about the Balfour Declaration as though it came down from Mount Sinai with Moses, as though it is one of the 10 Commandments. The Balfour Declaration. One white racist promising another white racist somebody else's land. That's what the Balfour Declaration is all about. Lord Balfour promised his friend Lord Rothschild Palestine for the Jewish people. Who cares? Who is he to give anything to anybody? But this is what it was. And even in, almost every street in Israel has a Balfour Street or a Balfour Declaration Plaza. And then moving forward a few decades, we had the United Nations resolution to partition Palestine. Who is the United Nations to partition Palestine? But it was said that the Jews want Palestine, and it was said that the Arabs want Palestine, so we partition Palestine, and everything will be fine. And this is a map of the partition plan. And as the map very clearly illustrates, the partition was not done in a very fair way. One part is clearly larger than the other. Now, in 1947, when the partition plan was passed, there were about 500,000. The Jewish population in Palestine numbered about 500,000 people. This was the generation of my grandparents who immigrated there, and my parents who were born there. Some 500,000 people who made up the entire Jewish community in Palestine. The Palestinians, the natives of the land, were about 3 times as many, close to 1.5 million people. Yet, the United Nations, in its infinite wisdom, decided to give the larger portion of the country to the smaller community. And it's interesting because to this day we hear people say, this is really all the Palestinians' fault because they rejected the partition plan. Well, first of all, nobody asked them. So it's not like they had an opportunity to reject. But can you imagine not rejecting it? That the United Nations would come and slice off the larger portion of your country and give it to a community of immigrants, really, who just came off the boat. And somehow everybody thought, or maybe they didn't think, but the assumption was that maybe this would work just fine, that everything would be just fine. Now, another reason this is such an important point, the partition plan, is from that moment on is when we have these two opposing stories, these two diametrically opposed histories that have emerged. And when people look for balance, perhaps you can find balance if the differences are small, if the differences are in small details or maybe a date here and there. But when the stories are diametrically opposed, that means only one can be true. There is no room for balance when you have two stories that are completely the opposite of each other. Now, the story that I grew up on as an Israeli, and the story that is basically accepted in the West, is that after the Arabs rejected the partition plan, they began an attack against the Jewish community in Palestine in an attempt to kill and destroy the Jews and destroy this small community that they created. Thankfully, the Jewish community was stronger somehow. They were more advanced, they were more developed, they were quick on their feet, and they were able to defeat the Arabs. And remember, these Zionists, this Jewish community, they claim to be the descendants of King David, who defeated Goliath, and the descendants of the Maccabees, who defeated great empires, and basically the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, who were, were always victorious against all odds. And now here they were, and they defeated the Arabs. And they established a Jewish state once again in the land of Israel after 2,000 years. Well, this is almost a biblical story. How can you refute this? How can you argue with such a romantic, like I said, almost biblical story? Who would dare say that this is not true? And it's such a powerful story, too. The problem, of course, comes up when we start looking at the details. So the two communities, even though one was much smaller than the other, were both expecting to and were hoping to be recognized as states. And they began investing in developing institutions of state. But there was one thing that the Zionists, the Jewish community in Palestine, developed that the Palestinians never did. And that's an armed militia, a fighting force. By 1947, the Zionist militia in Palestine numbered close to 40,000 armed, well-trained, highly motivated men. My father was an officer in that militia. Well, there was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no Palestinian armed force. There never has been, actually, a Palestinian army. So if there was no Palestinian armed militia, who were these Arabs that attacked the Jewish community? Now, we know that other Arab countries intervened in Palestine some 6, 7, 8 months later. But at the end of 1947, who were these Arabs that attacked, and what did they attack with, if there was no fighting force? And Israeli historians have been looking at this, actually, and over the last 15, 20 years or so, they've been writing about this, answering this question, and they've been actually validating what Palestinians have said all along. It was not the Palestinians that began an assault at all. As soon as the United Nations gave its stamp to the creation of a Jewish state, or the Jewish state, in Palestine, the Zionist Militia began a massive campaign that today can only be categorized as terrorism and ethnic cleansing. It was a massive campaign of an armed militia against an unarmed civilian population that lasted for 12 months, with a clear intention of completing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It was a brutal terrorist attack that lasted 12 months, at the end of which almost 80% of the country was conquered. Hundreds and hundreds of cities and towns and villages were destroyed, including mosques and churches and schools and, of course, homes. And somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile. So it turns out it wasn't such a romantic, heroic story after all. It was a brutal act of terrorism, but now we can see that the pieces fit the puzzle. And again, Palestinians have been claiming this for decades. Israeli historians have validated this over the last 20 or so years with people like Ilan Pappé and others. Now, one of the claims that's made quite often by the Zionists is, well, perhaps a few villages were destroyed, perhaps a few Palestinians were forced to leave, but really there was nothing there. There was nothing there. It was desert, camels, poor farmers. There was really nothing there. So I'd like to show this picture of the city of Jaffa before 1948, before the Zionists came. The city of Jaffa was a major Arab city on the coast of the Mediterranean. It was a city of close to 120,000 people. It was a city with concert halls and movie theaters. Several newspapers were printed in Jaffa. Writers' guilds and trade unions and a rich political life and a rich business life took place in Jaffa. The Jaffa oranges, you may have heard, was, a very famous industry there. And in a matter of 2 weeks in 1948, this city, this bustling city of close to 120,000 people, was reduced to less than 4,000 people, concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wires and Israeli soldiers surrounding them. And on the ashes of the city of Jaffa, today we have, in a picture that's almost from the exact same angle, the city of Tel Aviv. The city of Tel Aviv still calls itself Tel Aviv Jaffa, Tel Aviv Yafo. And there is still a small Palestinian community and a small part of the original city of Jaffa that's still there. It's a small community that is neglected and subject to oppression and subject to racist laws. Israeli police does not go in to solve crime. Palestinian youth in Jaffa have no hope and no reason for hope, no opportunities. To say that they're second or third class citizens is an understatement. Now, this is important to understand, not only so that we have a clear understanding of what took place 66 years ago, but also to understand that Palestine cannot be reduced into the West Bank and Gaza. During the peace talks, people always talk about Palestine as being the West Bank and Gaza, as though that is what Palestine is. That is where the Palestinian state, so to speak, will be established. And many people really think that there's a Palestine in the West Bank and that the other Arabs who live in the other parts of the country are just Arabs. And quite often I hear people say, wait a minute, but these aren't Palestinians, these are the Palestinians. Well, you cannot reduce Palestine to the West Bank and Gaza because the entire country is Palestine. And Palestinians, whether they live inside Israel, so to speak, with Israeli citizenship, or they live in the West Bank, suffer and are the subject of the same brutal oppression and the same environment of racism. And I think this is very, very important to understand. Now, again, to talk about this today, about the Nakba today, I think is particularly meaningful. But I remember when I heard the term Nakba. Nakba means catastrophe. Now, we Israelis call the War of 1948 the War of Independence. We see it as a great act of heroism. For me, it was even more so. My father fought in that war, so the stories of the battles and the stories of the heroism and so forth were, something I grew up with, not something I read about. And then here we have the Palestinians call it a catastrophe. And I remember my first reaction when I heard this many years ago was shock. I mean, how can anybody say something like this? How could you possibly call such an act of heroism a catastrophe? The revival of the Jewish people and so on. And over the years, I began, of course, my book talks about the journey. This is part of the journey, is understanding why it was a catastrophe and what actually took place. I think, though, what is often misunderstood is that people think that the Palestinian Nakba took place in 1948, whereas, in fact, it began in 1948, it continues today, and it gets worse and worse every single year. I took this picture in a refugee camp about a year ago, the Gaza refugee camp. As you can see, the picture speaks for itself. Abject poverty. No running water, no electricity, no proper sewage system, no access to health care, no access to proper nutrition, no access to work. Now, when we look at these children, I think it's important to understand these children this refugee camp, and the others as well, is maybe no more than half an hour's drive from major cities inside Israel. The very places from which their grandparents were forced to leave. The reason they live under these in this abject poverty, in this terrible conditions, is because they're not permitted to go into Israel, to go into Palestine, and enjoy the kind of life that Israelis do. You don't see Israeli children like this anywhere. Israel is a modern, developed state. People live like this. The only reason Palestinians still live, some 4 million people still live like this, is because Israel denies them access back to their land, back to their country, and to the facilities and to what Israel has to offer, what Palestine has. This is happening every single day. It's getting worse by the day. It's happening under our watch, 3 hours from Geneva, not in some remote mountaintop in Afghanistan or anything. Millions of dollars, billions of dollars are being poured into Israel to support Israel, to do business with Israel, and that's what makes this worse. Every day somebody supports the state of Israel. Every dollar that goes to support the state of Israel makes this worse. It's unjustifiable. It's inexcusable that this goes on every single day. 3-hour flight from here. Never mind the fact, nobody talks about this. You don't see this in the press. You don't see this on television. You don't see it in the newspapers. Now, my book is a memoir, so it talks a lot about my family because my family was involved so much with the establishment of the State of Israel, and this was the background. Being the general's son is not being the son of the general, but it's being the son of this whole environment, very patriotic environment. So this is a picture of my mother when she was young. My mother was born and raised in Jerusalem, and she still lives in Jerusalem. She's 87 years old, almost 88. And there's a story that she told me many, many times, and I mentioned in the book, of an experience that she went through in 1948. Now, when I talk about Jerusalem, I'm talking about not the old city of Jerusalem, but the modern neighborhoods, the newer neighborhoods that were built outside of the city. By the way, how many people here have been to Israel, Palestine? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, quite a few. How many people are here actually from there? Okay, thank you. So I'm talking about those neighborhoods, and if you've seen them, they're still there. They're beautiful homes, beautiful, very distinct Jerusalemite Palestinian homes. The neighborhoods are still there. Of course, the people were forced to leave. So it was 1948. The Zionist Militia came in and took the Palestinian neighborhoods, forced the Palestinians to leave, And these beautiful homes were made available to Israeli families, and my mother was offered one of these homes. And these are very beautiful homes. She was living in a small apartment at the time with her parents and 2 small children. And she refused. She refused to take the home, and she said, and she still says this today when she talks about it, she said, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How can I possibly take the home of another mother? Knowing that these people, this family now has to live in exile, is forced to live in exile. And then she'd go on to describe the looting, how the Israeli soldiers came with the trucks, and these were well-to-do homes, well-to-do families, and began looting the furniture and the rugs. And if you've seen, there's a great documentary about the books that were stolen, rare books that were stolen. In fact, the Zionist forces were so organized that they even had a librarians unit go after the forces, house after house, to steal books that are now in the in the Hebrew University. And she talked about it with great shame. I mean, how could they have done this? How could we, as a people, have done this? How could Israelis behave this way? Which is a wonderful story, and we would have hoped that more people would have done what she did. Sadly, very few did. But beyond the story, there was something very troubling to me growing up hearing this story. And it wasn't really until I was working on the book several years ago that I understood what was troubling to me about the story and why it was troubling. And what I found was that her story contradicts the national narrative. So as a boy growing up with a very Zionist, patriotic Zionist upbringing, that was a problem. She was contradicting the national narrative because the Zionist narrative is perfect. It is morally perfect. We deserve the land. The whole country is ours because we're Jews. Yet, when the United Nations decided to partition the land, we agreed to the partition. Then they attacked us. Thankfully, we won. And then we asked them to stay. We asked the Arabs to stay, and they left. We asked them to stay, and they left. Well, where's the moral dilemma? If somebody leaves the home and there's a family that needs the home, why not take it? Why was she presenting, my mother was presenting a moral dilemma, but there was no moral dilemma. There are no moral dilemmas in the Zionist story. It's perfect. Even when atrocities are mentioned. For example, the massacre of Deir Yassin, which was commemorated only about a month ago. Deir Yassin was a small village in the outskirts of Jerusalem. I'm sure many of you know. When the Zionist forces came in, they surrendered, but the forces came in and committed a terrible massacre anyway. And Israeli children learned about this in school, that this took place, it was wrong, it was a terrible thing, and so forth. Women and children were killed. However, we also learn that important Zionist leaders told us that although the massacre was a bad thing, thankfully, as a result of the massacre, hundreds of thousands of Arabs left, which allowed us to establish a Jewish majority. And we all know, of course, nothing is more important than having a Jewish majority. And I remember this vividly, learning this as a boy. And this continues even today. Israel bombs Gaza, knowing full well they are killing and burning children. But it's okay, because Hamas is in Gaza, and we are defending ourselves. So the Zionist story is foolproof. It's perfect, morally. And like I said, there she was poking holes at this very perfect story, and it took me a while to understand. Now, between the end of the war of 1948 and 1967, this is what the map looked like. Israel occupied almost all of Palestine, with the exception of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then we hear again that 1967, once again, Arab armies were getting ready to attack in order to destroy the Jewish community, the state of Israel. And why? Well, because the Nazis tried, and now the Arabs are trying, and this is part of our lot as Jews, as Israelis. And thankfully, the Israeli High Command decided or got the approval, and I go into this in quite detail because it's a very interesting story. In order to engage in a preemptive strike, they attacked the Arab armies. They destroyed 3 Arab armies. They managed to kill close to 18,000 Arab soldiers at a loss of 500 or 700 Israeli soldiers. 700 as opposed to 18,000. That number should already tell us something. And in 6 days, this time in 6 days, talk about a biblical story here, they managed to destroy these armies, conquer the West Bank, conquer the Sinai Peninsula, conquer the Golan Heights. Now, my father was a general by then. That entire group of young officers who fought in 1948 were the generals of 1967. Now, once again, like I said, we hear that there was an existential threat. The state of Israel was under an existential threat, and therefore the preemptive strike was inevitable. And when I was working on the book, I went into the Israeli Army archives, mostly to learn about my father's career. But the one thing that I found that I knew was going to be interesting was to read the minutes of the meetings of the generals of the Israeli High Command leading up to the War of 1967. They are available in the archives. Historians have looked at them. A lot has been written about those meetings and what took place. So I really wasn't expecting I would see anything new or, And as soon as I began reading, I noticed something that my father says in one of the meetings, and then the other generals repeat, and that is that Israel has, not only is there not a threat, but Israel has now an opportunity because the Arab armies are so weak and unprepared for war. That the Arab armies, particularly the Egyptian army, which was really the only army of any consequence, were unprepared for war. That they would need at least 1.5 to 2 years before they'll be ready for war, and therefore this is a good time to attack, and we need to attack now. And they demanded that the Israeli cabinet give them the approval. Nothing about a threat, not an existential threat, not any other threat. In fact, then they go on and say the fact that the Egyptian army has entered into the Sinai has made it even easier to attack and destroy them. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. I won't get into all of this. Now, like I said, in 6 days, pretty much it was all over. And I think what's important to recognize is that at the end of the 1967 war, Israel basically erased Palestine off the map for good and established a single state over the entire country with exclusive rights for Jewish people. Now, again, this is another lesson that's important not only for the history books, but it's important in order to understand what is happening today and why the peace talks are nonsense. The peace talks assume somehow that there could be a situation where an Israeli government will allow the Palestinians to establish a state somewhere in those boundaries. As soon as the West Bank was taken, almost within minutes, Israel began a massive campaign of destruction, destroying towns and villages and neighborhoods, forcing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into exile, and building massively for Israeli Jews only in the West Bank. Exactly what they did in the rest of the country after 1948. It wasn't like anybody waited to see what would happen. It was immediate. And one of the first orders given by the Israeli army after they took the West Bank was that the water in the West Bank belongs to the state of Israel. The West Bank has one of the largest water sources in the entire country. So to assume that this can be reversed, to assume that there could be an Israeli government who would allow the Palestinians to establish a state in the West Bank or any other part of the country is an absolute misunderstanding at best, or just a flat-out lie, but a complete, absolute misunderstanding of this reality, of what Zionism is about. The Zionist claim is that this is our country. This is the Jewish people's land. It's the land of Israel. The state of Israel is the caretaker, but the country belongs to the Jews. How could they possibly let anybody, or why would they possibly, or who will possibly allow anybody else to establish a state there? It's an impossibility, and besides the ideology, look at what happened over the last 66 years. A thorough, ongoing campaign of ethnic cleansing, a thorough, ongoing campaign of massive building for Israelis only, not only in the West Bank, of course, in the entire country, but, in regard to this peace talks issue, the West Bank is what's important. The West Bank was integrated into the rest of Israel very quickly. The notion that there could be another state there is absolutely absurd. And I think it's important to understand this. Now, they call it the Jewish state, by the way, which is interesting because most Jewish people don't live there. Most of the people who do live there are no longer Israeli Jews, but are Palestinians. Out of 12 million people who live there today, 5.9 million are Israeli Jews. The rest are Palestinians. So how is it Jewish exactly? Do they espouse Jewish values? Thousands of political prisoners, denying people water? Or does any of this represent, the best of Jewish values? So there's really nothing Jewish about the state of Israel, but it is a state that gives exclusive rights to Jewish people. That is the only distinction. Now, this is a picture of my father when he was still in uniform. And he did something very interesting. And again, it's important to talk about this because there's this notion out there that Israel wants peace, that there's a peace initiative. There was something today here, I guess, about an Israeli peace initiative. So let's talk. I think it's important to take a look at this. When the war was over, he stood up in one of the first meetings of the Israeli High Command, and he said, now we have an opportunity to make peace with the Palestinians. We need to recognize the rights of Palestinians to self-determination, allow them to establish a state in the West Bank and Gaza. We will make peace. Obviously, this small state will be at peace with Israel, and then we will be able to stop, fighting all the time. We could be at peace with the Palestinians, and perhaps then later on with the other Arab countries. He said, if we don't do this now, and this is 1967, mind you, if we don't do this now, he said, we will become an occupying power. There will be a resistance. We're going to have to fight this resistance. It'll destroy the moral fiber of our society, and we will end up a binational state. Exactly what happened between 1967 and today. It was almost prophetic. That's exactly what took place. And of course, as he was saying these things, Israel, the state of Israel, went on with massive building in the West Bank and so forth. Now, we keep hearing, of course, that Israel wants peace. And there's no one to talk to on the other side. The Palestinians are either terrorists, or they're Hamas, or they're this, or they're that, and there's nobody to talk to. So I think it's important just to go over this a little bit. My father retired from the military shortly after the war, and he continued to he basically became an advocate for this issue of Palestinian rights, particularly a Palestinian state. And these were the years that the whole notion of the two-state solution was being formed. In the mid-1970s, he and several other Israelis formed an organization that was dedicated to promoting this idea. And as soon as they announced the formation of this organization, they were contacted by the PLO, by the Palestine Liberation Organization, major figures, Yasser Arafat's top people, top aides. In this picture, my father is with Issam Sartawi, who was later killed, and he was one of the contacts. They later on became good friends as well. And at first they would meet, this was in the 1970s, they would meet in secret, they would meet in European capitals, in Paris, or they would meet in North Africa. And when they would return from these meetings, my father would always report to the prime minister immediately. He had that kind of access still in those days. And so the Israeli government was kept abreast. The Israeli government was fully informed about these meetings. But they wanted nothing to do with it. Later on, in 1983, they actually met with Yasser Arafat in a highly publicized meeting in Tunis. There were pictures in the newspapers and so forth. Then not only did the Israeli government want nothing to do with it, in a move that was led by Shimon Peres, by the way, Mr. Nobel Peace Prize, the Knesset passed a law that made these meetings illegal. They passed a law making the meetings between these Israelis and the PLO illegal. Well, these were not people that were going to back down. They said, fine, arrest us. The meetings continued. This was the 80s. Then suddenly 1993 came around, September 1993, the Oslo peace process, Oslo Peace Accord was signed. Some of us are old enough to remember, it was the White House lawn. President Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo peace process, and many people thought, this is really happening. The Soviet Union already fell. Apartheid in South Africa fell. This is next. What many people did not realize is that by 1993, there was no more chance to establish a Palestinian state anyway, because there was no more West Bank. The West Bank was already fully integrated into Israel. The purpose of the Oslo process was not to bring peace. The purpose of Oslo was to bring the Palestinians to surrender. to further fragment the Palestinian society, the Palestinian politics, allow Israel to establish a stronger hold on the country, a stronger hold on the resources and the people. Which is why it led to nothing. For the last 2 decades, these peace talks have led to nothing because they were not meant to bring about peace. They were an attempt to bring the Palestinians to surrender. And darn it, they won't surrender, so we have no peace. The Oslo peace process was supposed to bring to a final solution within 5 years. From 1993, that would have been 1998. In the summer of 2000, when Bill Clinton was almost out of office, he decided to bring the parties together, and they met at Camp David. It was supposed to be the second Camp David. And they sat there and sat there and sat there for days and days and days, and when they came out, they had no agreement. And again, some of us are old enough to remember when they came out, Bill Clinton said, well, the Palestinians gave some, but the Israelis gave more. In other words, basically, the Palestinians are not willing to make concessions. Yasser Arafat was not willing to make concessions. And then the Israelis came out and said, now we know the true face of the Palestinians. They're all terrorists. They want to destroy us and so on. Now, claiming that the Palestinians, particularly Yasser Arafat, were not willing to make concessions is a very interesting claim. Because under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, the Palestinians were ready to give up 80% of Palestine, establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, but no less than the West Bank and Gaza, the entire West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. They were willing to recognize and make peace with the very state that destroyed Palestine and forgo the right of the refugees, Palestinian refugees, to ever return. That is not a concession? Has anybody ever made a bigger concession than that? But Yasser Arafat refused to go any further. He refused to surrender completely, which is why he was vilified, and 4 years later, he died with Israeli tanks surrounding his office in Ramallah. In fact, I think it's fair to say that for 30 years, the last 3 decades, up to his death, Yasser Arafat was the most consistent voice for peace in the Middle East. He supported and established this whole idea. He was behind this whole idea of the two-state solution from the mid-1970s, and he was consistent in his willingness to make peace with Israel based on that, but not anything less. But Israel's not interested. Israel was never interested. In fact, there's never been an Israeli peace proposal. Because in terms of Zionist thinking, it's a zero-sum game. The land is ours, end of story. So I think this is important in the context when Israelis like to say they want peace, and they try to bring peace, and there's nobody to talk to remind them that this is not true. Now, I talked a little bit about the Palestinian prisoners. This is a picture of Samer Isawi and his sister Shireen. Samer Isawi holds the record of the number of days being on hunger strike and surviving. And now his sister, who is an attorney, is also in prison. Both of them, by the way, with no charges. And I think it's important to remember that probably one of the most important but the least talked about issues is the issue of the Palestinian prisoners. Israel holds thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners in its jails, which of course it calls them security prisoners, it calls them terrorists, but the vast majority, and this is according to Israeli sources, the vast majority of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails have not been charged with acts of violence. Have not been charged with acts of violence, the vast majority. They are political prisoners. And then you've got hundreds and hundreds of them that have not been charged with anything at all. Now we have to remember, we're talking about the Israeli military courts. According to the Israeli military law, a kid with a rock is a terrorist. And we're talking about thousands of prisoners that have not been charged with acts of violence by the low standards even of the Israeli military courts. And then you've got the administrative prisoners who are not charged with anything. So even by the low standards of the Israeli military court, there was nothing with which to charge these people. Yet they sit in prison indefinitely. indefinitely, some of them for years. So there was a hunger strike a couple of years ago, and now we have hunger strikers again. How is it that especially a country like Switzerland doesn't kick out the Israeli ambassador? I don't know. So many violations of human rights. And pull back and bring back the Swiss ambassador from Tel Aviv. Now, besides all of that, the world recognizes the rights of people to resist. There is a United Nations resolution that says that the world community, the struggle of people under colonial, alien domination and racist regimes for the implementation of their right to self-determination and independence is legitimate. There is no better characterization of Israel than this: colonial and alien domination and racist regime. Almost by its own definition, that's what Israel is. Where the world recognizes the right of people to resist. Now, what's interesting is, and we talk about the Palestinian context, the vast majority of Palestinian resistance, as we see reflected in the prison population, has by and large been unarmed, nonviolent resistance. The armed portion of the Palestinian resistance has always been the smaller portion, although it gets all the news. But the vast majority of Palestinian resistance over the years, and particularly even more so today, has been nonviolent, unarmed resistance. Not by chance, but by principle. And yet again, it's one of these issues that nobody talks about. Thousands and thousands of people sitting in jails. Prisoners sitting in jails. So another portion of the more personal aspect of the story and a more personal aspect of the book has to do with my sister's daughter. My sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem in 1997. She was 13 years old. Now, in Israel, of course, as you can imagine, when something like this happens, of course, it's big news. In this case, it was, of course, bigger news because here's the granddaughter of an famous Israeli general, the granddaughter of Miko Peled, killed by Palestinians. And not only was he a famous general, but he became an advocate for Palestinian rights. So, of course, this was big news. I was living in the U.S. at the time, so I took the first plane home. When I reached my sister's apartment, it was filled with people who came to express their sorrow, but also filled with reporters. Every news agency around the world, every language that you possibly can imagine was there. And the usual questions are always asked about retaliation, about revenge, about who's responsible, and what do we do with them, and how do we show them, and so forth. And when my sister, I know, was here, some of you may have met her, my sister Nurit came out and spoke. She said two very interesting things, two, I think, earth-shattering things. In terms of retaliation and revenge, she said, I don't want to hear anything about that. She said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. No real mother would want to see this kind of grief happen to any other mother. And she quoted a line from a famous Hebrew poet, Bialik, who wrote that even the devil himself couldn't invent a vengeance that's appropriate for the death of a child. And both she and her husband Rami said, in terms of who's responsible, they said, well, who is it that's maintaining this brutal oppression against the Palestinians? Who is taking away their land, destroying their homes, denying them of water, throwing their fathers and brothers in jail, shooting their children in the schools, denying them any sense of future or hope? Who's doing all this? And both of them said, we hold the Israeli government directly responsible for our daughter's death. Because what do we expect? That we maintain this brutal regime and there will be no price to be paid? This is what happens when you oppress another people. This is exactly the price that is paid. So, of course, now this became even bigger news because here's this Israeli mother who's turning everything upside down. On the one hand, she just buried her young daughter. On the other hand, she's turning the world upside down. We know that the Palestinians are terrorists and the Israelis are victims. We know that the Israelis want peace and the Palestinians won't make concessions, yet here's this mother doing all this. And she became very outspoken. She became an activist. She's a founding member of the Russell Tribunal of Palestine and so forth. And in my personal life, I had to go back to the U.S., go back to work, go back to life. And how do you do that after something like this? It's not an easy thing to do. But I was very fortunate in that in the U.S., in San Diego, where I live, I found a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group, a dialogue group, so to speak. And I began attending meetings. And I was born and raised in Jerusalem. And this was the first time I ever met Palestinians. In the book, the line that begins the chapter that talks about this begins with the words, "My journey into Palestine began in San Diego. I was 39 years old." And as I began meeting with Palestinians for the first time, I also realized something even more profound, and that is that it was the first time I was ever with Palestinians in the same place, and we were equal under the law. There is no situation, there is no place in Palestine, Israel, where Israelis and Palestinians are equal under the law. It doesn't happen in Jaffa, it doesn't happen in the Galilee, it doesn't happen in Jerusalem, not in the Negev desert, it doesn't happen, of course, in the West Bank or Gaza, it doesn't happen anywhere. There is no place that Israelis and Palestinians live under the same law. And I talked about this when I was in South Africa recently, and I could see people related to this right away. The sense that suddenly you're with the other, but you're not different anymore. And it's a very powerful, very positive experience. And then I began, so first of all, hearing about the Nakba and hearing about this other narrative, and realizing, first of all, that there is another narrative, and then that out of the two narratives, only one of them is true, and it's not mine. And with all this heritage that I bring with me, this Zionist patriotism that I brought with me, this was a very painful, very difficult experience. But then I began venturing into Palestinian cities. I talk about it in the book. The first time I went to visit Nazareth, and I visited the West Bank, and this experience of seeing Arabs all around me and so forth. It was a very interesting and very powerful experience, again, letting go of the fear and allowing the trust to take its place. And then the way the book ends, and the way I'll end my remarks today, has to do with where we go from here. And Marie-Paul mentioned the sense of hope, and probably the most common remark I get from people who have read the book is that they have a sense of hope. It gave them a sense of hope, which I think, of course, is very important. And again, if I didn't have hope, if I wasn't absolutely certain that there was a solution and it is upon us, I wouldn't be doing this. That it was very possible, I wouldn't be doing this. But I think it's important to have a clear idea of where we are and what is taking place. Otherwise, how can we possibly work towards a solution or even define a solution? Like I said before, today Israel, the state of Israel is governs the entire country. It is one state over the entire country, whether we call it Palestine or Israel, with exclusive rights for Jewish people. And it's important to note this. People who support the state of Israel, whether fully or with some reservations, but who support the idea of the state of Israel, have to come to terms with the fact that it's a package deal. The state of Israel comes with racist laws, oppression against Palestinians, thousands of political prisoners, and regularly bombing and killing people in Gaza and other places. It is a package deal. That is the only way to maintain a racist, colonialist ideology, is through that. There is no other way. Just like people supported apartheid in South Africa, there are people who support the state of Israel. Of course, the people who supported South Africa today are ashamed. They don't talk about it so much. I think this will be the same thing with Israel in about 10 years. People will forget that they supported Israel and claim that they never did. But the reality is that if anybody supports the state of Israel to any degree, they have to own up to the fact that this is what they're supporting. It's a brutal, racist regime. But it's not the only option. There is another option. And again, probably the most striking example is South Africa, though only in my lifetime we saw racist and fascist regimes fall here in Europe. We saw them fall in Latin America. There is a possibility to remove a racist, exclusivist regime and replace it with a democracy. And that is exactly what needs to happen, and I believe will happen in Palestine. There is a very strong, very persistent, very effective resistance taking place around the world. Somebody defined it as a global intifada, which a lot of times people don't realize. There's a BDS movement, which is growing and becoming more recognized and more respected, the movement calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. 4 or 5 years ago, nobody knew what it was. Today, they discuss it in Washington, D.C. at the Israeli lobby offices. They're worried about it. They're spending money on it. They discuss it in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem, and they're worried about it, and they spend money trying to combat it, and they're failing. More and more companies, more and more individuals, more and more trade unions, more and more banks are divesting or applying boycotts and sanctions against the State of Israel. More and more artists refuse to perform in Israel. And it is a growing, and like I said, not only growing, but it's also gaining more and more respect and recognition around the world. On campuses all over the U.S., which is where I am most of the time, U.S. and Canada, but also certainly here in Europe, the voice of the Palestinian cause is becoming clearer and louder. Every single year in the U.S., certainly, and I know here too in Europe, more universities, more campuses hold pro-Palestinian events, Palestine Awareness Week, Israeli Apartheid Week, more than there are enough people to be out there and speak, because I get invited and several others get out there to speak at these events. They organize events, they build walls on campus, they educate thousands of students, they do tremendous work. These 20, 21-year-old students do tremendous work on campuses, and they fight a tough battle because the administration usually doesn't like that, so they get in their way. They fight the Israeli lobby, the pro-Israeli groups, and they're gaining ground. Because the only argument on the other side is anti-Semitism, and people are getting tired of that. And then you've got the popular resistance in Palestine itself, which is growing. Again, it's growing, it's becoming more effective. Israel already admitted, the Israeli army admitted, they have no response to the nonviolent resistance in Palestine, the popular resistance in Palestine. Nobel laureates are going there to visit and march in Bil'in and other places. 5 Broken Cameras, I don't know if anybody's seen 5 Broken Cameras. If you haven't, you should. They almost won an Academy Award. It is a wonderful documentary showing precisely how this very, very dedicated, principled, and persistent resistance, dedicated to resistance and to freedom as much as it is dedicated to nonviolence, is being met by the brutality of the Israeli forces. Never mind the tear gas, but the bullets, and the torture, and the beatings, and the arrests. Yet these guys, every time they come out of jail, they lead the marches. So these 3 parts of the Palestinian resistance are growing. On top of that, the reality on the ground is unsustainable. According to UN report, in Gaza alone by 2020, there's going to be another 500,000 people. So are they still going to have to rely on tunnels to get water and food and antibiotics? Of course, now the tunnels are closed. There's this new general in Egypt who closed the tunnels. I mean, it's a completely insane reality that is completely unsustainable. And I believe that all of this will inevitably lead, or is going in the direction, to the fall of Zionism, just like in South Africa it led to the fall of apartheid. And I think it's important to understand that these 2 words are interchangeable. Apartheid and Zionism are interchangeable. Zionism is a racist, colonialist ideology that has to go. And the chances, and this is where the hope comes in, the chances of success in Palestine are far greater than anything we've seen anywhere else in the world. If this room was filled with Israelis and Palestinians, you think you could tell them apart? There's no way you could tell them apart. These are 2 very similar societies, highly educated societies, large middle class, moderate societies mostly. Each of them have their own, crazy fanatics, and each of them have their own very corrupt leadership. The Israeli prime minister is going to jail, Ehud Olmert, by the way, you may have heard. Sadly, he's going to jail for corruption. He should have been going to jail for murdering people in Gaza, but that's a whole other story. But that's kind of the reality. You go to jail for stealing. You don't go to jail for killing children. So the 2 societies are very, very similar and are ready to get together and work together. The key, however, has to be the fall of Zionism, the creation of a democracy. The key is equal rights. Like many of you have been there, you've seen it's a very beautiful country. It's got great promise. It's got great potential. It's got a lot of good, smart people there. The key ingredient is equal rights. I would call on all of you to line up clearly behind the banner of a single democracy with equal rights, 1 person, 1 vote, and encourage others to do so the same. People are not in this room today. And then there is absolutely no question in my mind that we will see the end of the conflict and we will see peace for Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.